So last week I asked you to think about something in your life that didn't make sense. Something that you could not understand. So because I am old, I will be watching TV with Nancy, and we don't have cable or any of that. We just have the Prime Video and stuff, but I will be watching a commercial and have no idea what the commercial is about. I cannot understand what they're doing and connecting it to the product. And part of that is my age. Part of it is that I don't buy a lot of stuff. And so as I'm looking at it, I find myself disconnected from the product, the placement, and the advertising. And I look at it and I say, you know, if they spent $1 million advertising that, they wasted their money on me. The truth is they probably well placed it for the audience that they are looking to attract. We're going to learn today the audience that Solomon is interested in. Verse 16. I said to myself, look, I have amassed wisdom far beyond all those who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has thoroughly grasped wisdom and knowledge. Thoroughly grasped. Have you ever heard the concept, ignorance is bliss? I mean, what does it mean? And why may that be true? I mean, I think about the fact that there are times when I didn't know something, and I'm very glad I didn't know it, because as Jesus said, worrying about something that you can't do anything about is not good. Solomon says, I have thoroughly grasped everything around me. I want you to think about the Garden of Eden. Satan's temptation to Adam and Eve. God placed them in the garden and said, look, you know good. And Satan shows up and he says, look, if you eat of this tree, you will know both good and evil. And there is this feeling that we need to know things that we don't really need to know. But somehow, if we don't know them, we feel left out. We feel like we're not complete. And so we want to know more than we really need to. And when we know more, it leads to an incompleteness because we suddenly realize there's nothing we can do about it. Verse 17. I applied my mind to know wisdom and knowledge, madness and folly. I learned that this too is a pursuit of the wind. Why is it and what is it that you wanted to know more than anything else when you were a child? I want you to think about it. Think of yourself. You're 7 years old, 8 years old. What is it that you wanted to know? What is it that you wanted to understand? When you were a teenager, what did you want to know? What was the most important thing that you could understand? How about as a college student? A new mom or a dad? And then I put because at various stages in your life, what is it that was just hidden from you that you felt if you could understand this, if you could grasp this, it would make you a better mom or dad, it would make you a complete teenager, it would make you a child that understood. No, I got a sinus infection last week in New Orleans, and it's draining like crazy. But I want you to think about this. And he says, you know, not only did I try to understand the good stuff, but I even chose to understand madness and folly. And he labels it madness and folly. He intentionally seeks out that which the world, and he says, is worthless. And he says, I learned this too. It was just a chasing after the wind. Verse 18. For with much wisdom is much sorrow, As knowledge increases, grief increases. Think about something that when you knew this much, you were okay. But as you increase in knowledge, you also increase your level of responsibility. I think back to my elementary school days and how I thought that the world was never going to get more complicated than that. How dare they? They expect me to read and write and learn things and do an exam. Had to remember all this. Then I got to junior high, then high school, and then college. Then, you get your job, and you want to be the boss. The problem is, once you become a boss, you realize that it's not just getting to wear the different uniform, but there's also a responsibility factor. I was the shift manager at a restaurant when I was going through grad school. Nancy and I lived 25 miles away, and anyway, I got home one night and couldn't remember if I turned the oven off. I had to turn around and go all the way back. Why? Because I was the responsible one. See, if I'd just been an employee, it would have been, somebody else's problem. But as the manager that night who signed off, I had to go back and make sure that it was turned off. And I got there, and sure enough, I turned it off. I just couldn't remember it. Solomon says, the more I knew, the more sorrow kept piling into me. The connection between social media and depression, suicide, and anxiety. Mental health problems is increasing at a rate of 13% per year. That's according to the National Institute of Mental Health. 13% increase in mental health problems over the last few years. According to research study of American teens ages 12 to 15, those who use social media over 3 hours each day face twice the risk of having negative mental health outcomes, including depression, anxiety symptoms. That's from Yale University. I said to myself, go ahead. I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy what is good. But it turned out to be futile. How can enjoying what is good be futile? Because there is a lot on social media that's good. But there's also this expectation. Last year when the Barbie movie came out, they were trying to fix a lot of the things that Barbie had become best known for, such as an impossible stereotype of body image. Everything being perfect. And as they worked through this, as they fix things, and this is what we're doing today, we're trying to fix things that we don't like. And Solomon says, even the good, it turned out to be futile even when I was enjoying what was good. This is crazy. Because you see, we assume that the more we know, the better off we are. We assume that the more that we understand, the better we'll be able to take care of things, the more that we'll be able to change the things that are bad. We understand that the more exposure we have to, all these different ideas and cultures and things, it's going to make us better people, and yet it hasn't as a world. I was listening to a bunch of folks in the narthex this morning talk about the Olympics. And the problem with the Olympics is that we all come together, and yet we discover that we have a lot in common and we have a lot of differences, and then comes the fighting over who this and what and when, where and how and why, and there's all this stuff that goes on behind the scenes, and which ones are the famous and which ones aren't, and which ones are the good guys and which ones are the bad guys, and unfortunately there's all these sub-levels that take away from the goodness of the moment. And if we're not careful, we get down into the nitty-gritty so much that we forget the whole purpose of why we were doing it in the first place. Go ahead. I'm going to test it. I'm going to go out and enjoy things. I'm going to do everything I can possibly do. I will not deny myself anything. But it turned out to be futile. I mean, I think about this. You know, when I was a kid, they invented the multiplex theater. We had Colorado 4 cinemas. We had a cinema down the road with 4 movies. And once in a while, they would have a day when they said, you can buy 1 ticket and you can go see all 4 movies. And my friends and I thought that that would be fantastic. And we often would sit through a movie that we didn't really care about, didn't really want to see. We realized that more is not necessarily better. If you've ever been to a buffet, we used to have Perry's Smorgasbord down here in Waikiki. But oftentimes more is not better because in order to justify the price, they have to lower the quality of the food. And you wind up eating too much of some things. And the sad part is when you see the busboys taking entire stacked plates of food and just throwing it out. More is not necessarily better, even if it's good stuff. I said about laughter. It's madness. And about pleasure. What does this accomplish? A number of years ago, I was working on a project, and we started talking about golden parachutes. And there's 2 ways that golden parachutes work. A lot of the golden parachutes, by the way, are the CEOs who get in trouble and do terrible things, and they basically get fired, and they get dozens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars because it was promised to them in their contracts. If we sever our relationship with you, we will give you X number of dollars. And so even though they're fired for doing bad things, they wind up very, very wealthy individuals. But there's another type of golden parachute. And I actually got to meet somebody who pulled the chute. Another type of golden parachute are people who say, I'm sick and tired of doing everything I am doing and doing all this for a world that doesn't really care. And even if I'm making tons of money at it, I'm not going home and feeling good about myself. And so all of a sudden at age 45, maybe 50, they pull the ripcord. They walk away from corporate America. And they start to do something that they know is going to make a difference in the lives of people. In about a month and a half, we're going to work with Sony Amati. Sony she's one of these people who's a corporate fixer. And among other things, she went to work for Ghirardelli Chocolates. And at the time, they had about $500 to $600 million a year in sales. And they said, we think that, there's a bigger market. We just don't know how to do it. And Sony went in and literally said, you need more flavors. And they said, okay. And they went from being 500 or 600 million to over $1 billion in sales. She did the same thing with several other companies, increasing their revenues by half or sometimes maybe just a third, but she took them well past anything they'd been able to do by themselves. That was her job. A few years ago, Sony said, this is good. I make a ton of money. I'm important. People are always calling me. People want me. But I really want to make a difference in my life. She grew up, by the way, not as a Christian. She went to a Catholic school because that's what you do in India. Her father was not happy when he found out she was going to be baptized. It's a whole life story. We're going to put all this down in film in a few weeks in September. And she decided to go to work for Link. That's our inner city ministry. And she took all of her talent, all of her ability, and she's working with our Link network. And it's just amazing that this person that we could never afford chooses to work with a group to spread the gospel and to take care of people. And there's a lot of people out there that you discover who have walked away from the corporate world and are now using their talent in the church to make a difference. And this is where, when you look at Solomon and he says, what about laughter? What about pleasure? I mean, there's only so much of this. And yet he finds himself saying, it just didn't do it for me. Verse 3. I explored with my mind how to let my body enjoy life with wine and how to grasp folly. My mind still guiding me with wisdom until I could see what is good for people to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. Two interesting thoughts. The continued use of the word I. I did this, and I did this, and I did this. And second, I let my body go, but nevertheless guided by wisdom, my great wisdom that's beyond all other people. Is it possible to see yourself from an outside perspective? To be your own Jiminy Cricket? Is it possible to allow yourself to go just this far and know that you will always be able to stop yourself from going too far? See, this is a question that we struggle with. Because when you talk to people who are addicts, they will often say, I can stop anytime I want. That's why I don't need intervention. Well, then why don't you stop? Well, I don't need to yet. Solomon says, I dove in feet first, then head first, allowed myself to do whatever my heart desired, but I was guided by wisdom, so I was not worried about myself. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. We're reading this thousands of years later. What do you think the people in Jerusalem and Israel were thinking about their king if he was doing all this? How would we feel? And how do we feel when we discover what people that we idolize or people that we are to fear and respect are living a life that is just crazy? A constant parade through of the newest, latest, bestest. Solomon says, I was guided by wisdom, so don't worry. Verse 4, I increased my achievements. I built houses, planted vineyards for myself. Notice how he says it. I didn't plant the vineyards for you. I planted the vineyards for myself. So what would you do if you won the lottery? How would you spend $500 million? How would you spend $1 billion? The guy that won the $1 billion lottery in Southern California, I forget how many literally multi-million-dollar homes he owns now. He's got a fleet of cars. Have you ever heard about Jay Leno? He's got this huge garage full of very expensive cars. Clive Cussler, one of the authors I read, that was what he did. He collected all these fancy old cars. Because you look at your bank account and you've got hundreds of millions of dollars and you just feel like you got to buy something. And there's always somebody around you saying you got to do something, buy something, invest. And you start buying ranches and you start buying homes. And a long time ago, our principal's son married the heir to the computer land fortune. And they didn't get a lot of money, but they got to go. And occasionally, Dad had places all over. He owned a castle, and it was either in Scotland or England. And they got to go over there and live there for a while. But I think about this. I think about people who own properties that they've never seen. They were talking about the fact that up in Sun City, Idaho, a few weeks ago, it's called Billionaire Summer Camp. And literally hundreds and hundreds of Learjets were landing. And all these corporate jets. There wasn't enough place to park them all. So sometimes the pilots have to fly in, drop off their people, and then go to Boise or one of the other places and wait until their boss calls and says, pick me up. Imagine having a plane and a staff whose only job is to get you wherever you want to go at a moment's notice. Having a chauffeur, a fleet of cars so many that you couldn't possibly drive even one a day, and in a month you still haven't driven all your cars yet. What would you do with all of it? He says he planted a vineyard for himself. Would you buy your own brewery? Would you buy your own restaurants? What would you do if you had all this money? How many homes, cars, investments, planes, events do you need? Where do we think happiness comes from? And I'm not talking about emotion. I can make you momentarily happy by telling you a joke, sharing with you a good story, feeding you ice cream. Unless you're dairy intolerant, then I'd have to give you something else. But I can make you momentarily happy. I'm not talking about that momentary happiness. I'm talking about a feeling of deep down satisfaction, of wholeness. What does it take? Where does it come from? What is it that you would need in order to feel that? See, this is what Solomon is really asking. He says, I went out and I would ask people, what's your favorite restaurant? What do you do when you want to have a weekend off? Where do you go? What do you experience? And he says, I went around and I simply allowed myself to be guided by all of these people, and wherever they went, whatever they did, whatever they said made them feel good, I tried all of those things. And they didn't bring me this feeling of satisfaction or wholeness that I was looking for. Verse 5 and 6. I made gardens and parks for myself, planted every kind of fruit tree in them. I constructed reservoirs of water for myself from which to irrigate a grove of flourishing trees. Now notice the way he's writing this. I did all this for myself. This is important because he's writing this, not us. Now, was this really for himself or was it for his people? So in corporate social responsibility, there are three primary things in corporate social: altruistic, strategic, and ethical. This all started basically in the 1960s, although it was going on before that. But in the 1960s, there came this movement where everybody realized that companies should do good because, well, we give them our money, but they should turn around and do it. Now, for a long time, Starbucks, by the way, didn't even have any advertising. The advertising was done by its people. They would sponsor various events. They would do good. They would do things like bring us your coffee grounds and, we'll get them out to people. Starbucks didn't need to advertise. Tom's Shoes. Places like this, all of these, Ben & Jerry's, all of these had this built-in CSR where they said, look, you have given us money, we want to take some of our money and do good with it. We're not a nonprofit, okay? We're not a B Corp, but we feel like we need to take some of our proceeds, some of our profits, and reinvest it. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to either do it because we have to, and so that's altruistic, and altruistic is we're going to do something that comes right back to us. So Molson Coors, okay, they have this big drunk driving program, especially around New Year's Eve. Haagen-Dazs. Haagen-Dazs is big about saving the honeybees. Anybody figure out why they need to save the honeybees? Because without bees, you don't have ice cream. Okay? So in other words, we're going to do something that does good, but it's really going to come back and just reinvest in us. That's altruistic. Then there's strategic. Strategic is we want you to see that we're doing good, and it's about this. So United Airlines says, hey, second people to get to board are military. Okay? Or you go to Target. Hey, use your red card. 10% is going to go to local schools or wherever. Buy one shoe, get one free. And the second pair goes to somebody who doesn't have shoes. In other words, all of this is about pointing back. Ethical CSR is you do good for just the sake of doing good. That's what churches are supposed to do. Everything we do is not to reinvest in ourselves, but everything we do is supposed to just be because that's what we exist for. We're good because it's expected of us. So when Solomon says, I did all these things for myself, did other people get the trickle-down economics of this? Or was it true that he really just did it for himself? In other words, I did this, and I did this, and I did this, and I was the only one. Verse 7. I acquired male and female servants and had slaves who were born in my house. I also owned many herds of cattle and flocks, more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. So what's the purpose of owning slaves? Well, you need somebody. If you're going to keep coming up with all these new endeavors and all these new projects, you got to have somebody who's going to build these mansions. You got to have somebody who's going to build these temples. You got to have somebody who's going to go out and do all this stuff. And so, then you need a larger workforce. What is this about slave children being born into your house? You're literally creating an entire society. You see, and it's all about, just in case, that next vineyard, that next house, that next event is the one that finally puts me over the top and I go, finally, I'm happy. Because I keep trying, and every time I try, I never quite get there. But it just might be the next one, or the one after that, or the one after that. And so I've got to stockpile everything that I can so that I just keep building up more and more and more until I have more than everybody else. Because somewhere in there, I'm going to find happiness. Verse 8. I also amassed silver and gold for myself, and the treasure of kings and provinces. I gathered male and female singers for myself, and many concubines, the delights of men. Wine, women, and song. I mean, this is it. And again, I ask, what do you think people thought about Solomon? Were they impressed? Were they embarrassed? Did they hurt for him? Were they jealous of him? I mean, when you really stop and think about everything that Solomon has going on, what was it like? I mean, he says, I decided to have my own choir. By the way, his dad already had that. And every time he wanted it, he just snapped his fingers and they came in and sang him songs. Sing happy songs, sing sad songs. Write me a new song. He said, I had concubines. At one time, according to the Bible, he had 300 wives and 600 concubines. A lot of the wives, by the way, were given to him every time he made a peace treaty. You see, if I'm going to make a peace treaty with you, I give you one of my daughters, you give me one of your daughters. Now we're family, and so we can't attack one another, okay? So a lot of the wives were trophy wives in that respect. But he says, I gathered all this up because somewhere in there I was hoping to find my happiness. And at this point, by the way, I mean, he's done everything, been everything, gathered everything. He keeps saying, I gathered more than everybody else around me. I had more of this, more of that than anybody else had ever had before me. Verse 9. So I became great, surpassed all those who were before me in Jerusalem. And my wisdom also remained with me. Solomon says, I didn't have to sacrifice my wisdom. I didn't have to give up who I was. When I was growing up, I loved the Beach Boys. And the original Beach Boys were very different from the later Beach Boys, very much like the Beatles. Brian Wilson was introduced to LSD. He was introduced to several individuals who taught him how to meditate, got under the control of one particular guru. And he got to the point where he said that he couldn't create unless the proper mood was laid. And the proper mood included usually drugs, meditation, and various other things. And he said, now I'm creative. And the creativity, by the way, was a very different thought process, a very different creativity than in the early days. And for some of us, we looked at it and we said, well, I'm not going to buy those albums because that's just not my style. But yet he says, this is the real me. This is the me that was always bottled up and that struggled in order to get out. When you are the GOAT, the greatest of all time, what's the downside? We use the title a lot today, especially in sports, you know. And I think one of the problems with being the GOAT is somebody's always chasing you. You always feel like you need to take it to the next level. You can never be content. It's hard to know when to retire. And there's always someone who has advice for you. And I look at boxers especially. So many of them, they literally make hundreds of millions of dollars and yet wind up broke when they retire. A lot of the sports athletes the same way. And every time somebody who's 28 years old retires from the NFL, I usually look at him and say, he's probably one of the smarter ones. He went out at the top of his game, got enough money in the bank to live comfortably, and wind up being a sports analyst and a few other things. But there's always the question, are you defined by what you do, or do you define what you do? Because if you are defined by what you do, the moment you cease doing it, you suddenly feel like you're nothing anymore. My first couple of years here, we had guys that would come in and they'd say, hey, Pastor, I want you to pray for Master Chief so-and-so or for Command Sergeant Major so-and-so. They're retiring after 30 plus years of service. And I was like, why do they need my prayers? And he says, because the life expectancy of these guys is about 5 years. They've never known anything but the Army. They've never known anything but the Navy. They invested themselves. They went through Korea and Vietnam. They've been everything. Every morning they knew exactly what to wear because the uniform of the day was told them. They knew exactly what they were going to do. Their whole life was wrapped around their job. And now when they step out, they're going to go into a world that they don't understand and don't have any idea about. And unless somebody can go in there and do an intervention, their life expectancy is roughly 5 years. So I did some research and found out how true that statement was. It's why, more and more now, not just the military, but so many organizations are trying to help people transition when they get close to the retirement age. They start asking them questions. Do you know who you are? Do you know what you're going to do? Have you thought about this? Because we always say, you know what, I'm just going to step away and I'm going to sleep in and I'm going to wear whatever I want and I'm going to eat whatever I want. I'm going to do. And that lasts just a few weeks, maybe a few months. And then we start with the struggles. Because we're born to have routines in our life. So Solomon is getting to this point and he's saying, I'm the greatest. People come to me just to sit and listen to me talk. They bring treasures from all over the world. He says, but I'm still not happy. Luke 16:19-21. There was a rich man who would dress in purple and fine linen, feasting lavishly every day. But a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, was left at his gate. He longed to be filled with what fell from the rich man's table. But instead, the dogs would come and lick his sores. Seeing that the rich young ruler walking away, Jesus became sad. He said, how hard it is for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God. For it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. Those who heard this asked, then who can be saved? And Jesus replied, well, what's impossible with men is possible with God. Then Peter said, look, we have left what we had and followed you. And so he said to them, I assure you, there is no one who has left a house, wife, or brothers, parents, or children because of the kingdom of God who will not receive many times more at this time and eternal life in the age to come. Lazarus and the rich man. If you know their story, Lazarus goes and is brought into the bosom of Abraham when he dies. The rich man goes to hell. The rich man is down in hell going, just send Lazarus down to dip his finger into water and cool my tongue. Let him come and minister to me. I mean, that's his job, right? I'm still rich and famous, even if I'm in hell. And Abraham says, no, you got all your good stuff in the life. He didn't get anything. And this isn't about money. And this is really important that we understand. This is not about money. It's about choices in life, and it's about where we see our value. Then we get to this one where Peter says, look, I gave up everything for you, Jesus. The rich young ruler goes away mad and sad because he can't give up what he had because it's important to him. Peter says, look, we gave up what we had for you. And Jesus says, you're going to get it all back and more. And the question is that literal or figurative? Because the health and wealth gospel churches teach that if you give all this stuff up for God, you're going to get more back. So in other words, if I actually tithe to God, I'm going to get 20% back. If I give 50% to God, I might get 75% back. Whatever I give to God, I'm going to get more back. And that's their literal interpretation of what Jesus is saying. Lutherans say it's figurative. It's not about being repaid dollar for dollar. It's about an understanding. It's about a wholeness. It's about a peace that surpasses human understanding. It's about a knowledge that even though we don't deserve it, we get to go to heaven because God in his grace and mercy has wrapped himself around us. And we have things that you cannot buy with money. You have things that you have an understanding that goes beyond what books and professors and universities can teach. And this is hard because most of us, if I do a good job, I expect to be paid. And if I do a great job, I expect to get a bonus or a tip. And so God, if I'm going to be faithful to you, I expect that you're going to pay me back. The problem is that everything I do is still going to fall short of what I would need to be saved. And that's one of the things that I keep forgetting. And so I keep working harder and harder and harder to make God happy, thinking God's going to have to pay me back. And God says, you're still woefully short of the minimum that I would require for you to get into heaven. I can't give you a bonus or a tip because you don't even meet the minimum qualifications. But I'm going to give it to you anyway because I'm a God of grace. And this is where Peter still doesn't understand because this is pre-crucifixion and resurrection. Verse 10, all that my eyes desired, I did not deny them. I did not refuse myself any pleasure, for I took pleasure in all my struggles. And this was my reward for all my struggles. He satisfied his eyes and his heart. No mention of his soul. Now this is important. I took pleasure in all my struggles. The purpose of the struggle, and this is, I think, a turning point in this letter. I wasn't struggling for the sake of struggling. I was struggling because I was trying to prove to myself. I was trying to discover something, and I knew that I could not sit and wait for it to come to me. I had to go out and see for myself what I think I already knew, but I needed proof of it. When I was in chemistry class in high school, I remember the teacher always saying, all right, today we are going to combine these two chemicals and this is going to happen. My thought process. Well, if you already know what's going to happen, why do we have to do it? And he would say, because you have to know that it's going to happen. Oh, okay. He says, it's not enough for me to tell you. You need to know. All right, now that I know that, let's move forward. So we would do all those experiments. And then I would say, when you add this and this, okay, this happens. When you do this to this, this happens. Now I understand cause and effect. It's not just a book knowledge in my head. It's actually now an experiential thing that I can actually say, yes, I did this, and then I did this, and then this happened. And so I think this is a turning point where Solomon says, I actually took pleasure in my struggles. Because as I struggled, it was a process that I learned from. So what kind of experiments take place before a car is allowed on the road? or an airplane in the sky or a medication on the shelf. And why do they go through this whole process? When you think back to COVID, and they said, all right, we think we have come up with a medication that is going to help with the relief of COVID symptoms and save lives. And then they said, we have to violate a bunch of our rules and regulations because we don't normally do it this quickly. And as my son reminded me, a lot of times, if you were going to come up with a cure for, let's say, arthritis, you have to have thousands of people that you can test because it has to be, well, this works on this type of arthritis in this situation at this point. And to find those people is hard. COVID was everywhere. And so they said, we can speed it up because we now have X number of people that we can treat and test and find out how well this works. So that was number one. Secondly, the government said, billions of dollars, we don't care, do it. Okay? And so they were able to get all of this done. But we know that cars and airplanes, they go through a tremendous amount. If you've ever watched the History Channel on the making of the Boeing 747, and it's absolutely amazing. You know, they actually throw frozen chickens into the engine to find out what happens. And they strap a Boeing down and then they lift the wing until it snaps. They do all this to know exactly how much pressure and all this. Cars, they go through all this, the safety. Now, how far do they push the tests, though? Because this is what Solomon is asking. If you and I are going to know where we find joy, peace, love, mercy, if we're going to, how far do we look to find those things? Should they be at our fingertips? Do we have to venture around the world? How far do we have to go? What do we have to do in order to find what we're looking for?